So recently I've been thinking about Jujutsu Kaisen's Shibuya Arc and how absolutely phenomenal it truly was. It's something that I would consider borderline perfection. And that's not to compare it to other stories and their respective best arcs, but it's something about Shibuya just clicked. Everything meshed together so incredibly well to create a memorable, lovable experience. The way I want to look at Shibuya though is a little bit different. I'm going to focus on peaks, and this is a very normal thing throughout narratives and specifically within arcs, how these peaked moments kind of control and manipulate the narrative and, more importantly, the reader's perspective to enhance the overall experience. Considering war arcs can be very detrimental, stressful, and overly obnoxious to actually pull off successfully, there's a lot of things riding on it. And to be able to do it in a way that is valuable and sometimes even recontextualize your story completely is probably the best outcome you can hope for. To make this more digestible, I'm going to simplify this package. Peaks means moments, specific moments within arcs or within a story that is the highest of the high that you can get. It's kind of a contradiction because peaks are usually meant to be peaked over by other peaks, and eclipsing them is something that you want to avoid pretty much at all cost. But there's a handful of things that goes into creating these peaks, especially within war arcs, considering those peaked moments are going to be some of the highest within your entire story. These things would be consequences and time, and then directly connected after it would be power and emotion. Now all of these things can be separated but also joined at the exact same time, and they can be played upon in the exact same type of way, pulling, pushing, or fueling off one another to create the best experience possible. So when it comes to the Shibuya arc, all of these things are within here, but the biggest and most surprising ones that are actually somewhat neglected purposefully is consequences and time. For some reason there's this weird misconception that consequences need to be within a war arc. That's not entirely true. While it does set some sort of expectation and atmosphere and overall tone for the arc in general, it doesn't have to be something that's so obnoxious. It doesn't have to be something that's completely relied upon. And consequences usually for most people boil down to death, killing off a vitally important character. Whereas you can have the exact same consequence without having the death and still have it be just as valuable and use it in a lot of different ways that isn't writing or hoping that the reception for that will pay off. So when you remember Shibuya, the two massive consequences that you can think of that is somewhat generalized would be Nanami's death as well as Gojo being sealed away. The peaked moments are not hinged or relying on these moments to escalate everything. If anything, these moments either completely recontextualize the story, characters, or they set the tone or atmosphere for what's to come. So already we're kind of moving away from the typical response for consequences and what people actually want and using them in a much more productive way. What's impressive about this, however, is the amount of time, or should I say little amount of time, that Akutami has actually had to build up to a war arc. Normally your war arc would take place smack bang in the middle of your story, and because we're so accustomed to Weekly Shonen Jump series being rather long, with 500 plus chapters, 700 plus chapters sometimes, it's not surprising that you eventually get that war arc, maybe 200, 250, 300 odd chapters within a story, but having it start 80 chapters within your narrative is very early and very rare, which makes it even more difficult to bridge that emotional connection to this entire event, because you have such little time to build up the response to these characters, to these individuals, to these powers and abilities. The war arc is definitely shaped and molded, and the foundation is laid out very early in advance. And in Kaisen's case, it's been there basically since the beginning, but you don't necessarily see it until Akutami wants you to see it. And it's in a very open, deliberate type of way that is up for conversation. So before even going into Shibuya, the time we've spent with characters is extremely small, but already so captivating and engaging, where we wholeheartedly enjoy all of these individuals. This is obviously going to differ for every single person, but it's still impressive that the Shibuya arc is as good as it is with such a little groundwork behind it. Once again, it's very rare that you would see a story try and do this, because the war arc can easily make or break the reading experience. It's very easy to fumble, to warp, to deteriorate everyone's expectation and have a very sour taste afterwards, if not done correctly, of course. You mix that with the consequences not actually being used the generalized way that you would think, and you have a completely different experience on your hand. These peaks are solely relying on power and emotion, and this is where the other side starts to come into play. Go back and think about the Shibuya arc, where it started, the tone and atmosphere that was set right at the beginning. You have some very minuscule type types of fights, but quickly it's suffocated with this very serious tone that Gojo is being sealed away. And we spent the prior 80 chapters understanding that Gojo is the most powerful individual within this story, and that if he disappears, the whole world changes. Curses become stronger, people go wild. He keeps this balance. So we already have this in the back of our mind, and it's the first thing that kicks off the Shibuya arc. To say that this is a consequence is probably a little bit unfair. This is everything. This is the living heartbeat of what makes the Shibuya arc so successful, so captivating, because you're on the edge of your seat wondering if he's ever going to return, and he doesn't. So now you mentally know that every encounter that these people come across, no one else is going to pick up the slack and try and save them. They are in this on their own regard. They have realistically no backup. So then you have these emotional and powerful fights that are so entirely different from one another. Some are mixed together, some are completely separate. The best examples that I can give you is Chozo and Yuji being the first to somewhat introduce itself. And this is after a much more smaller fight, prior to the arc truly kicking off. Chozo and Yuji was intimate. While it did have power and it did introduce Chozo as a character, it was definitely more emotional. Because of this hand-to-hand combat, it didn't rely on overly flashy abilities. So we're coming to understand Chozo as a character. We're coming to see Yuji's mindset and how he's functioning within this arc against powerful individuals, yet it's purely emotional. That's the first peak. The thing with peaks is that they have to be bridged with more simplistic or lower moments to help elevate that peak even further, be it artificially or naturally. So we have a handful of fights and encounters and conversations within these peaks that are still very enjoyable, but not as overwhelming as you would expect until we get to that next moment. Those next moments, however, come extremely quickly. Dargon's domain expansion with all of these individuals coming out to play, including Toji, is a showcase of power. This is easily the first biggest moment for it, and quickly after that it's followed up by Jogo and Sukuna, another showcase of power. As you can see, the peaks start to rise exponentially, with each event or encounter climbing higher than its predecessor. Right after Jogo and Sukuna, you have Sukuna and Megumi with his new curse. It's a little bit emotional, but it's still a massive showcase of power. This is the highest point of power that you actually get, and it's easily the most impressive because everything after this is solely focused on emotional. That is where the peaks lie, and they're not meant to overshadow or go higher than the powerful peaked moments. Instead, they're meant to parallel them. They're meant to go hand in hand with them. So right after Sukuna and Megumi, we have Yuji come back filled with all of this emotion, seeing the destruction that Sukuna has caused, how it's overwhelmingly suffocating and controlling Yuji's mindset. And then directly after this, we have Nanami and Mahito, a death that sparks this emotional peak and controls the whole ending half of the Shibuya arc. Not only does it introduce probably one of the most intimate and personal fights within the story to date, Mahito versus Yuji, but it's opened with one of the most gruesome but heart-wrenching goodbyes you could have for a character. A student witnessing the death of his mentor, a mentor that specifically told him to not allow his emotions to control him, to not allow his emotions to overthrow his concentration, because that one split second of disruptance can get you killed. Yuji is dealing with all of these mental gymnastics within a very short period of time, and it's just as, if not even more impactful than the powerful peaked moments we just witnessed. It's continuously escalating. What's truly impressive that just adds the final piece to the puzzle is that Yuji subverts expectation. For the most part, you would expect in this moment in time for Yuji to power up, that he's going to be severely angry or upset or emotional, and those very deep-rooted emotions and his anger towards Mahito is going to come flowing out, and that's going to fuel his fight. It doesn't. Instead, it's completely internalized. It's not this massive blow-up in power and this showcase of abilities. Instead, he draws it deep inside, and while he's cracking underneath, the person that comes to glue him back together is none other than Todo. So while normally you would expect a main character to grow in power or have a new form or a new ability based on these emotions, instead Akutami has made it so he's more fragile, that what he has experienced is too much for himself, and he's trying to stick true to his mentor's teachings. And Todo picking up that slack and helping him is easily the most heartbreaking thing. Not to mention, within this very personal fight between Mahito, Yuji, and now Todo, we also have a heavy scene with Nobara, just to fully cement the idea that this fight is personal, that it's not meant to be a showcase of big flashy abilities or power. We've had those moments. Once we witness that, we know this is the ending of the arc, that whatever comes from this, whatever outcome is produced, it's going to end here. Because for us as readers, this moment in time has been building up since the very beginning of the story. And while you could easily end a war arc on a death, on a massive reveal, on a big showcase of power and flashy abilities, a new form or a new tactic, instead we focus so deeply on Mahito and Yuji and their relationship, how they've grown throughout the entirety of the story, but also from the beginning of the arc around chapter 80 to where we are now, 120, 130. At the end of the day, I don't think you could get more personal, more emotional, or peak even higher than what we already have. And while you may enjoy other moments more, which is perfectly fine of course, this right here is what the arc was building up towards. And the fact is that Akutami has masterfully fabricated the Shibuya arc with so many peaks, so many varieties, so many different emotions that conflict and contrast and elevate characters beyond belief, that elevate abilities beyond belief, that elevate consequences beyond belief. The very small, minuscule amount of time he's had to build up to this moment to make these things work is at the end of the day something I consider perfection. A lot of you may not feel that way, and that's perfectly alright. With all of this, it only makes me even more excited to see how he's going to handle the rest of the story, what the final arc will actually produce, and even all of the moments in between. The current moments right now are impressive enough, and he continues to one-up himself further and further, throwing people these massive curveballs that we could never see coming. And I couldn't be more than happy and eager to see how he thrives from here. So with that being said, that is basically it. I would like to know what is some of your favorite moments within the Shibuya arc. Some of the more powerful moments with flashy abilities, or maybe some of the more emotional ones. There's a lot of great things to pick for. Maybe you just like the arc in its entirety and it's one of the best things that you've experienced, and I couldn't blame you for that, but I would love to hear your thoughts. But I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Drink plenty of water, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.